The wind carried the scent of pine and decay as Clara stepped off the wagon, her boots sinking into the soft earth of Blackthorn woods. The trees loomed high above her, their gnarled branches twisting together like fingers concealing a secret. Behind her, Samuel unloaded their meager belongings, his movements deliberate, his silence unnerving. To any passerby, they looked like an ordinary married couple seeking a quiet life away from the chaos of the world. But the woods knew better. The woods always knew. Their new home was a lonely cabin, long abandoned and cloaked in creeping ivy. Its windows were cloudy with age, its floors groaning as though it remembered every sorrow that had ever crossed its threshold. Clara tried to smile as Samuel lit the first lantern, its flickering light spilling over his face, and for the briefest moment, her heart clenched. There was something in his eyes, something too familiar, as though her brother's ghost peered through them. She shook the thought away. It had been years since the fire that took him. Years since she buried that part of her heart beneath the ashes. The first night in the cabin was sleepless. The forest whispered like a living thing, branches scraping the walls, the faint echo of a lullaby she hadn't heard since childhood drifting on the wind. Samuel slept soundly beside her, but even in slumber, his hand gripped hers with unnatural strength, his skin cold despite the burning hearth. When she finally rose before dawn, she noticed muddy footprints near the back door, one set hers, the other too large, too heavy, leading out toward the dark thicket beyond the yard. Clara followed them only to find the footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the creek, as though the forest itself had swallowed him whole. When she returned, the door creaked open behind her, and Samuel stood there, dripping wet, a faint smile curling his lips. His voice was gentle, almost tender, when he said, "You shouldn't go wandering, Clara. You'll wake them." Something cold rippled through her spine. "Wake who?" she asked. But he only stared, eyes gleaming with that same haunting familiarity, before whispering, "Our family." And in that instant, the forest seemed to lean closer, listening. Clara and Samuel's journey into the heart of Blackthorn Woods began as a retreat from the world, a desperate search for silence after the chaos that had consumed their family. The countryside had been whispering of the woods for years, how the trees grew so dense that the sunlight itself struggled to break through, how sound carried strangely within its shadows. Yet to Clara, those whispers were an invitation, a promise of escape from the memories that refused to die. The tragedy that struck them months before had left their home in town unbearable, its walls echoing with loss and suspicion. They were seen as cursed, people said, and Clara's fragile mind could not bear the eyes of neighbors who pitied her during the day and whispered about her at night. When Samuel suggested they move into the old family cabin that had belonged to her mother's side, a place long abandoned and avoided by locals, she agreed without hesitation, believing distance could quiet the ghosts of the past. The journey was long, the wagon creaking over uneven dirt paths that grew narrower the deeper they ventured into the forest. The trees rose higher, their trunks dark and wet with moss, closing in like ancient sentinels guarding something that did not wish to be found. Samuel remained calm and collected, his hands steady on the reins, his gaze fixed ahead. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words came slowly, almost rehearsed. Clara tried not to notice the coldness in his tone or the strange comfort he seemed to take in the isolation. The closer they came to the cabin, the more she felt the weight of the woods pressing around them, the air thick with the scent of rain and earth. When the cabin finally appeared, hidden behind a curtain of vines, it looked less like a home and more like something the forest itself had grown. Its roof sagged, and its porch leaned precariously, but Samuel only smiled faintly and said it could be fixed. Clara stepped through the doorway, brushing away cobwebs, and felt a strange familiarity she could not explain. It was as if she had walked into a dream she had half forgotten, one stitched together from childhood memories and buried fears. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, its cry sharp and lonely. That night, as they unpacked, Clara watched Samuel by the firelight, his features illuminated in soft gold. The flicker of the flames played tricks on her eyes, blurring his face until for a fleeting instant, she saw someone else, the face of her brother, the same curve of the jaw, the same quiet smile. Her breath caught in her throat, and though she told herself it was only the shadows, something deep within her whispered that the forest had not brought them peace, but remembrance. The town of Briar Hollow had always looked at outsiders with suspicion, but when Clara and Samuel arrived, the unease took on a life of its own. The first few weeks passed quietly, yet gossip began to spread like wildfire through the cobblestone streets and creaking taverns. It started with harmless curiosity, questions about where they came from, what tragedy had driven them into the woods, but soon turned darker. Old women in the marketplace whispered about the unnatural stillness that followed the couple, about how Samuel never spoke more than a few words to anyone and how Clara's eyes seemed haunted by things no one else could see. The townsfolk claimed they had seen her standing alone near the edge of the forest at night, murmuring to the trees as though speaking to someone unseen. There was something about the pair that unsettled people, though few could explain why. Perhaps it was the way they never joined the townsfolk on Sundays at church, despite living close enough to hear the bells. Perhaps it was how their small wagon carried only half the belongings one would expect for a newlywed couple, or how their hands never quite seemed to touch, even when they walked side by side. The blacksmith swore he had seen Samuel in town once before, years ago, when Clara's brother had been alive. Others laughed it off, claiming he was mistaken, yet a quiet unease settled over them all. The resemblance between the dead brother and the living husband became the talk of the town. Children were warned not to wander too close to Blackthorn woods, where the couple lived. The woods had always carried a reputation for strange happenings, echoes that mimicked voices, lights flickering between the trees, and the lingering belief that something ancient lived within its roots. Now, with Clara and Samuel there, the stories multiplied. Some said Samuel was not her husband at all, but her brother returned from the grave, kept alive by something dark and forbidden. Others believed Clara had lost her mind after the fire that killed her family and that the man she called her husband was only a reflection of her grief. When the pastor tried to pay a visit, bringing a basket of bread and blessings, Samuel met him at the door with a calm smile that did nothing to ease his nerves. The pastor later swore that the man's eyes were wrong somehow, too pale, too knowing. After that visit, no one from Briar Hollow ventured near the cabin again. From the town's edge, smoke from the couple's chimney curled into the sky like a silent warning. The people began to speak of them only in hushed tones, convinced that the woods had claimed them, body and soul, and that the union between them was not blessed by God but bound by something far older. Days in the cabin passed slowly, marked only by the soft ticking of the clock and the sound of rain tapping against the roof. Clara tried to fill the silence with small routines, sweeping the dust from the corners, airing out the rooms, hanging curtains that caught the dim light, but the house resisted her warmth. It felt like a place that wanted to stay asleep, to remain untouched. One afternoon, as Samuel chopped wood outside, Clara decided to explore the attic. The narrow stairs creaked beneath her feet, each step releasing the scent of mold and forgotten years. When she pushed open the trapdoor, a gust of cold air met her face, heavy with the smell of paper, wax, and decay. The attic was cluttered with old trunks and faded portraits whose eyes followed her in the dim light. She brushed away cobwebs and opened one of the trunks, finding it filled with moth-eaten clothes and yellowed letters. But what caught her attention was a large, leather-bound book resting beneath the debris, its spine cracked, its cover embossed with a cross that had long since worn away. It was the family Bible, one she remembered faintly from childhood but had never seen since her mother's death. When she opened it, she found the inside lined with dates, names, and handwritten notes in the margins. The entries stretched back centuries, tracing births, marriages, and deaths of generations who had lived in the woods before her. But the deeper she read, the more the pattern disturbed her. The same surnames repeated again and again, intertwining like tangled roots. Cousins marrying cousins, siblings joined in secret unions, families folding in upon themselves as though the bloodline refused to let outsiders in. Her hands trembled as she turned the brittle pages, discovering that the last entries bore her own family's names, her mother, her father, herself, and her brother. The dates blurred before her eyes, but one line stood out, freshly inked, as though written not long ago: Clara to Samuel, bound in blood, bound in vow. Her breath caught in her throat. The ink was still wet. For a long moment she sat frozen, staring at the words that refused to make sense. A shiver ran through her as she heard Samuel calling her name from below, his voice echoing through the house like a soft command. She closed the Bible and tucked it beneath her arm, her heart pounding. As she climbed down, the air seemed heavier, thicker, and when she looked toward the window, she saw Samuel watching her with a faint smile, his hands still stained with the dark sap of the wood he had been cutting. She said nothing, but in that silence, something between them shifted. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her to understand what she had truly inherited. The nights in Blackthorn Woods had always been unnervingly still, but after Clara discovered the Bible, the silence changed. It was no longer empty, it felt watchful. The forest began to speak in strange ways, low murmurs that rose with the wind, faint songs that drifted through the trees long after midnight. Clara tried to convince herself it was nothing more than her imagination, stirred by the isolation and the eerie history that hung over the place, but the sounds grew more distinct with each passing night. Sometimes she heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, crushing the leaves with a rhythm that matched the beat of her heart. Other times it was the whisper of her name, carried so softly that it felt like a memory instead of a sound. Samuel always seemed unbothered, sleeping soundly while she lay awake, her eyes wide open in the darkness, straining to catch each noise. One night, the sound came closer, so close that she was sure someone stood just outside the window. The moonlight was faint, but enough to illuminate the vague outline of a figure between the trees. She rose from bed, trembling, and moved toward the window, pressing her hand against the cold glass. The figure didn't move, only stood there watching. When she blinked, it was gone, leaving behind only the whisper of rustling leaves. She woke Samuel, but when he went outside with a lantern, there was nothing there except footprints that circled the cabin and vanished into the woods. He dismissed it as the work of stray hunters or animals, but Clara saw the shape of the footprints, bare, human, and familiar. The next morning, she found the back door slightly ajar, though she remembered locking it the night before. On the porch, small offerings lay arranged in a neat line, a broken locket, a child's ribbon, and a fragment of scorched fabric she recognized as belonging to her brother's old shirt. The sight made her blood run cold. Samuel stood behind her, his shadow falling over the objects, and when she turned to ask if he had seen them, his face revealed nothing, only calm, empty composure. That night, as rain poured and thunder cracked over the forest, Clara heard the humming again. This time, it came from inside the house. She followed the sound to the attic, where the air was thick with dampness and the faint scent of smoke. The humming stopped the moment she opened the door, leaving her alone in the dark, her pulse racing. She could feel the presence there, close enough to touch, and when she whispered her brother's name, the floorboards creaked as though something unseen had taken a step toward her. The uneasy peace between the couple and the townsfolk finally broke when Sheriff Alden received an anonymous letter. It was scrawled in trembling handwriting and delivered without a name, claiming that something unnatural lived in the cabin beyond Blackthorn Creek. At first, Alden dismissed it as superstition. Briar Hollow was full of tales about witches, ghosts, and blood curses, but the letter contained one detail that disturbed him deeply: Samuel's full name, written exactly as it appeared on an old death record he had seen years before. The sheriff couldn't ignore it. He saddled his horse and rode out at dawn, following the misty trail that wound through the forest until the air grew cold and heavy, and the sound of his own breath became louder than the birds. When he arrived, the cabin looked peaceful, smoke curling from the chimney, Clara tending a fire inside. Samuel greeted him politely, his face calm, his tone even. Alden noticed the man's manner, too measured, too controlled, as though every movement was being rehearsed. They spoke briefly about the town, about the repairs to the cabin, but when Alden mentioned the family's history, Samuel's smile faltered. He excused himself and disappeared into another room. The sheriff's eyes wandered, catching sight of the Bible on the table, its pages open to a family tree inked with faded names. Something about it tugged at his memory. He leaned closer and saw Samuel's name written twice, once beside Clara's, marked as her husband, and once beside hers again, marked as her brother. His pulse quickened. The handwriting of the newer entry was shaky, uneven, as though written by someone struggling to remember how letters worked. When Samuel returned, his demeanor had changed. He asked the sheriff if he believed in family curses, his voice low and distant, almost detached. Alden didn't answer, unsettled by the sudden shift in his tone. The conversation ended abruptly, and the sheriff left soon after, the weight of unease pressing against his chest. As he rode back through the woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watched the entire time, that something unseen had followed him to the edge of the trees. That night, unable to rest, he returned to the town's records. He found the birth certificates of Clara and her brother, Samuel, both registered in the same year, born to the same parents. Yet Samuel's death record, dated 10 years earlier, confirmed what he already feared: Clara's husband should not exist. The sheriff sat back in his chair, staring at the papers under the dim lamplight, his hands trembling. Outside his window, a shadow moved past, slow and deliberate, and for a brief second, he thought he saw Samuel standing in the dark, smiling. The days that followed the sheriff's visit weighed heavily on Clara, as though the house itself had absorbed his suspicions. Samuel had grown quieter, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. The silence between them stretched long into the evenings, interrupted only by the crackling of the fire or the distant cry of an owl. Clara tried to focus on simple tasks, mending curtains, sweeping the floors, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the Bible hidden beneath her mattress and the strange look on Samuel's face when she caught him staring. Then the scent began, the faint trace of smoke and something else, something achingly familiar. It was her brother's cologne, the same one he had worn before the fire that had taken him from her. At first, it came to her in fleeting moments, a ghost of fragrance lingering in the hallway or beside her pillow. Soon, it clung to the air so strongly that she could taste it. At night, her dreams grew vivid and cruel. She saw her brother's face emerging from the flames, his eyes hollow but full of longing, calling her name over and over until she woke gasping in the dark. Each morning, Samuel would be sitting beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his voice calm and soothing as he told her it was only a dream. Yet his touch felt too cold, his hand too steady. One evening, when she turned toward him, she noticed the faint scar on his jawline, the same one her brother had carried from the accident years ago. Her stomach twisted, and she looked away quickly, telling herself it was only coincidence, that grief had begun to warp her memories. But the forest did not allow her denial to last. While gathering water at the creek, Clara heard her brother's voice behind her, soft and broken, whispering her name just as he used to. She spun around, heart pounding, but only Samuel stood there, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't come here alone," he said quietly, stepping closer. His breath brushed against her ear, and with it came that scent again, smoke and cologne, wrapped in something ancient and sweet. Her knees weakened, and she stumbled back, unable to look at him without seeing her brother's face overlaying his. That night, she tore through the Bible's pages again, desperate for answers, and found a passage written in her mother's hand: "Blood remembers what time forgets." The words echoed in her head until dawn. When Samuel came to her that morning, his eyes soft with concern, she couldn't tell anymore if she was speaking to her husband or if her brother had finally come home. The morning after her dreams reached their most vivid, the sheriff returned to Blackthorn Woods, unable to shake the unease that had taken hold of him since his first visit. The air was colder that day, heavy with mist that clung to the trees like a veil. As he approached the cabin, he noticed something strange: no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life within. The door creaked open at his touch, revealing the faint smell of damp earth and iron. The hearth was cold, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of mud that led toward the back door and out into the woods. Clara was nowhere to be seen, and Samuel's belongings were still in place, untouched. Alden stepped carefully, calling their names, but the silence that answered was too deliberate, too dense, as though the forest itself was listening. Following the trail of mud, he moved toward the creek. The air grew thicker, and the buzzing of flies reached him before the sight did. There, half buried in the soft soil near the bank, lay something wrapped in a torn, weathered blanket. He crouched down, brushing away the dirt, and froze. The fabric was embroidered with delicate initials CH, stitched in the same careful hand he had seen on Clara's belongings. With trembling fingers, he pulled the covering aside and revealed bones, the curve of a skull, and remnants of what might once have been clothing. The blanket was stained a deep brown, the marks of age and decay hiding what was once blood. He stepped back, the realization clawing at his chest. Whoever this was, they had been dead for years, long before Clara and Samuel had returned to the woods. The sheriff wrapped the remains carefully and brought them back toward the cabin. He placed them by the hearth and studied the Bible still open on the table. The pages had changed, new lines of writing filled the margins, shaky and fresh. He read the words aloud, his voice breaking with confusion: returned to where he belongs. Rest for one, life for another. It made no sense, yet a sickening possibility began to take shape in his mind. He looked toward the door, feeling the faint vibration of footsteps outside, soft but unmistakable. He reached for his revolver, heart pounding, and opened the door to find Clara standing in the yard, her face pale and distant, her hands covered in dirt. Behind her, at the edge of the woods, stood Samuel or something that looked like him, his clothes wet, his expression empty. The sheriff's voice caught in his throat as the truth began to dawn. The man before him wasn't living in the way other men were. And the bones wrapped in Clara's blanket were not a stranger's at all. That night, the rain fell harder than it had in weeks, drumming against the cabin roof like a warning. Clara woke to the sound of the door slamming somewhere below, followed by the hollow echo of footsteps retreating into the woods. The other side of the bed was empty. Samuel was gone. She called his name, her voice trembling, but only the storm answered. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped outside, the cold rain soaking through her nightdress. The forest loomed before her, dark and endless, the wind carrying faint whispers that might have been her name. When the lightning flashed, she saw them, muddy footprints leading away from the porch, each one sinking deep into the earth as though made by someone half submerged. They trailed toward the creek and then vanished into the deeper woods. Something inside her told her not to follow, but curiosity pulled stronger than fear. The forest was alive with sound, branches creaking, the river groaning, and beneath it all, a faint humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Clara followed the footprints through the underbrush, her lantern flickering in the wind. At times, she thought she saw Samuel ahead of her, his figure barely visible between the trees, turning just enough for her to catch a glimpse of his face before disappearing again. She called out, her voice cracking, but he did not respond. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of wet soil and something older, something metallic. Her lantern's flame sputtered and went out, leaving her in darkness. Then she saw it, a faint glimmer on the ground, half buried in mud. She knelt and brushed away the dirt, uncovering a small, folded piece of paper sealed with wax. The storm had nearly destroyed it, but she recognized Samuel's handwriting. Her fingers shook as she unfolded it, shielding it from the rain. The message was short, written in rushed, uneven lines. "My sister, if you read this, you must let me go. The blood that binds us has no rest, and neither do I." The words blurred as the rain smeared the ink, but she could still make out his final line, "Don't follow the voices, they remember you." Her breath came shallow as the truth sank in, the weight of his secret pressing against her chest. The forest seemed to move around her, branches bending as if reaching out. When she turned to run, the lantern light flashed once more, catching a reflection in the creek. For a brief moment, she saw her own face mirrored beside Samuel's, their features blending as though the forest itself no longer knew where one ended and the other began. The letter slipped from her hand, carried away by the water as thunder rolled above, swallowing her scream into the night. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the woods drowned in mist and silence. Clara wandered aimlessly through the trees, her nightdress torn and soaked, her bare feet bleeding from the stones hidden beneath the mud. The letter weighed heavily in her pocket, its words echoing in her mind until they no longer sounded like Samuel's voice but something older and crueler. The footprints she had followed were gone now, washed away by the rain, but she could still feel their path guiding her deeper into the forest. The air grew colder with every step, and soon she found herself standing before an ancient oak that rose higher than any other tree in Blackthorn woods. Its bark was twisted and blackened, split open by age, and from within its roots came the faintest draught of air, warm and stale like breath. At first, she thought it was only a hollow, but when she knelt beside it, she noticed a wooden door buried beneath moss and earth. Its iron handle was cold to the touch, but the moment she pulled it, the door groaned open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The scent that rose from below was unbearable, damp soil, rot, and something metallic. Lantern in hand, Clara descended, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. The walls were lined with roots that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The deeper she went, the more the air thickened until it felt like she was walking through a living throat. At the bottom, she entered a low chamber carved entirely from the earth. The flickering light revealed shelves filled with relics, family portraits painted in muted colors, each face bearing some resemblance to her own. There were wedding rings, hair ribbons, cracked mirrors, and small wooden boxes inscribed with names she recognized from the Bible. Each object seemed to hum faintly, as though holding a trapped whisper. On the far wall hung a large painting, covered by a dusty sheet. When Clara pulled it down, her lantern nearly slipped from her grasp. It was a portrait of herself and Samuel, painted in the style of centuries past. They stood hand in hand before the same cabin, but their eyes were different, dark, empty, ancient. Beneath the painting was a carved inscription, bound as before, as always. A sound broke the silence, then a breath, or perhaps a sigh, coming from behind her. She turned and saw the outline of a figure standing at the top of the stairs, motionless but unmistakable. It was Samuel, his clothes torn, his skin pale and glistening as though the forest had birthed him anew. His voice came softly, almost lovingly. "Now you remember," he said, stepping forward as the roots along the walls began to stir like serpents, reaching toward her as if eager to reclaim what was theirs. The sight of Samuel standing in the dim light of that underground chamber froze Clara where she stood. His face was both familiar and strange, his eyes glimmering with something beyond human warmth, something that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the roots crawling through the walls. He moved toward her slowly, each step echoing like a heartbeat against the soil. She tried to back away, but the chamber seemed to shrink, the air thickening around her until her breath came in shallow bursts. Samuel raised a trembling hand, not in anger but in sorrow, and when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow weight of centuries. "You called me back," he said. "You never stopped calling me." His words clawed through her mind, unraveling memories she had buried the night of the fire, the desperate way she had begged for him to return, the whispers in her head that had told her he could. The room seemed to shift, the earth around them trembling like something alive. Faces began to form in the roots, her ancestors, pale and silent, their eyes black hollows filled with recognition. Clara felt herself swaying as the truth took shape. Samuel had not simply survived the fire, he had been drawn back from it, summoned through the same ritual her family had practiced for generations. The forest was their keeper, their blood its offering. Every union between kin, every forbidden bond, was not born of love but of obligation, an ancient pact to keep the line alive and the woods fed. Her mother's words in the Bible echoed in her mind, "Blood remembers what time forgets." Now she understood. The forest did not let its children die, it remade them, again and again. Samuel's skin flickered in the lantern light, as if struggling to hold its form. "It's my turn to return," he whispered, but not alone. The roots wrapped around Clara's wrists, their grip tightening like hands. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the earth. Samuel's expression twisted in agony and tenderness all at once as he stepped closer, his form beginning to blur. "The bond must remain," he murmured. The roots surged upward, pulling her toward him, their tendrils wrapping around both their bodies as the lantern shattered, plunging the chamber into darkness. The last thing she saw was Samuel's face merging with hers, his features dissolving into her own, until there was no separation between them, only a single shape breathing in the shadows. Above, the forest stirred as if awakening from a long sleep, its branches creaking in satisfaction. In the clearing where the old oak stood, the soil shifted once more, and two sets of footprints slowly sank into the ground, leaving no trace that they had ever existed.